Rabin and Arafat clasp hands again in Paris.
Arafat makes another bid for Jerusalem as Israelis stage massive protests.
Arabs rejoice as Arafat visits Gaza and Jericho.
This and more on this edition of the JNN Evening News.
From JNN in New York, Caroline Greenberg, Howard Barbanel, the JNN Evening News.
I'm Caroline Greenberg.
And I'm Howard Barbanel, and here's what's going on. Despite widespread talk of peace, terrorism continues unchecked and unabated in Israel. On July 1st, a terrorist stabbed and critically wounded Yoram and Chana Sakuri in their home in the settlement of Kiryat Netafim near Ariel. On July 6th, Palestinian gunmen killed a 17-year-old girl while riding in the family car with her father and brother, who were both wounded. The attack took place outside Kiryat Arba, which is a Jewish neighborhood of some 5,000 people overlooking Hebron. Also found slain was 20-year-old Private Aryeh Frankenthal, whose mutilated body was discovered in an Arab village just 6 miles from Jerusalem. These two slayings bring the death toll since the signing of last September's Israel-PLO Accords to over 52.
All this comes in the wake of massive releases of Palestinian Arab prisoners from Israeli jails. Busloads comprising hundreds of terrorists and agitators were released this month to coincide with Yasser Arafat's visit to Gaza and Jericho. Arabs in the territories were jubilant about the prisoner releases. The Cairo Accords specify that Israel will release thousands of prisoners. To date, over 2,000 have been released.
Traveling by car from the Sinai, PLO chief Yasser Arafat arrived in Gaza over the July 4th weekend, kissing the ground to chants of Allah Akbar, or God is Great in Arabic. Mobbed by his supporters, Arafat addressed throngs of Arabs in Gaza City. In his speech, Arafat repeatedly stressed Jerusalem, saying that name over and over again. He called yet again for the creation of a Palestinian state and tried to enlist Israeli Arabs living in the Galilee and Negev to participate in his quest for nationhood. Most Israeli Arabs reside in the southern Galilee and northern Negev. Arafat yet again indicated his desire to go to Jerusalem to pray at the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa mosques. Top PLO leader Nabil Sha'at put out a press release a few weeks ago boldly asserting that East Jerusalem will be the capital of an independent Palestinian state within 5 years. Jerusalem Mayor Ehud Olmert had this to say on that subject.
To share with you our confidence and determination that Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the Jewish people, will remain forever united and undivided as our exclusive capital. There has never been a time that Jews were not prepared to die for the city of Jerusalem. There is no other place like our city. There has never been a city in the entire history of mankind for which people prayed so much, about which people cried so much, and for which people yearned, prayed, fought, dreamt as we about Jerusalem.
Arafat then traveled to Jericho, where members of the Palestinian police were shooting their rifles in the air and women were dancing in the streets. Security was tight, and Israel closed off Jericho from the rest of the territories and Israel. Speaking in Jericho, Arafat again looked forward to eventual statehood and self-rule throughout the territories.
Demonstrations were the order of the day during Arafat's visit. The Western Wall and Jerusalem streets were jammed with demonstrators denouncing Prime Minister Rabin for making a pact with Arafat. Israel deployed nearly half its national police force in Jerusalem to deal with the demonstrators, who at times were quite emotional and emphatic in their opposition to the accords. Former Chief Rabbi Shlomo Goren called for Arafat's assassination, and his sentiments were echoed on the streets.
He's a killer. He's supposed to be dead.
Opposition leader Benjamin Netanyahu called Arafat's visit the first step in a Palestinian jihad, or holy war, on Jerusalem, and termed the demonstrations against Arafat the battle for the defense of Jerusalem. Prime Minister Rabin and other members of his cabinet have been lashing out at the opposition and the demonstrators, accusing them of incitement, possible coup attempts, and the like. Many observers, both in and out of Israel, have accused the government of trying to stifle legitimate protest and dissent. The government's panicking in the wake of 200,000 protesters at the Western Wall is similar to the reaction of prior labor governments to prior mass protests, such as those led in the 1950s by then-opposition leader Menachem Begin to David Ben-Gurion's accepting reparations from West Germany for the Holocaust, a position many Jews were against as taking blood money and making a pact with the devil. Many equate Arafat with Hitler and see similarities in the German and PLO deals.
Right after his whirlwind tour of Gaza and Jericho, Arafat flew to Paris, where he met up with Prime Minister Rabin and Foreign Minister Shimon Peres at a UNESCO awards ceremony. Both Rabin and Arafat were presented with peace prizes by Henry Kissinger. This provided yet another occasion for Arafat to shake hands with Rabin and then again with Peres. Arafat and Rabin will share in a $150,000 prize.
The PLO is slated to receive $500 million in aid from the U.S. over the next 2 years. The top Israeli newspaper Yediot Ahronot reports that the U.S. plans to open an East Jerusalem office of the U.S. Agency for International Development to oversee U.S. aid to the Palestinian Arabs. Israel is unhappy over the selection of Jerusalem for the site of the office. The PLO has been pleading poverty and linking the receipt of aid to progress on peace. However, despite a successful effort on the PLO's part to make the media believe it's broke, in fact, British intelligence reports that the PLO has $8 to $10 billion in assets, including ownership of airlines, duty-free shops, and factories, in the Third World and Eastern Europe. The PLO's estimated annual income from these assets is estimated to be $1.5 to $2 billion. The PLO also receives aid from Libya and Iraq. Many Washington observers have been asking why the PLO needs millions from the U.S. when it is not spending their own money to better the lives of their own people. The Clinton administration is also pledging big bucks to Jordan if it makes peace with Israel.
Also on the subject of foreign aid, Israel is reportedly looking for $5 to $8 billion to finance a Golan Heights withdrawal, along with the stationing of U.S. troops on the Heights. Senator Al D'Amato has been leading the fight in the Senate against U.S. troops on the Golan, calling it a bad deal for the U.S. and asserting that if a peace accord needs U.S. troops to back it, then it's not a good peace agreement.
Prime Minister Rabin asserted last week that war with Syria might erupt if territorial compromises with Syria are not reached in 3 to 10 years. Rabin has been justifying withdrawal as a way to thwart the massive arsenal of Scud missiles now in Syria's hands. Likud leader Benjamin Netanyahu sees it another way.
So the question is, how do you get to peace with Syria? How do you get to a formal peace with Syria? Well, let's ask what Syria was doing coming to Madrid. We initiated the Madrid conference. And you can assume that Mr. Assad understood that a Likud government headed by Mr. Shamir wasn't about to hand over the Golan Heights to him, and yet he came over. He came to Madrid. And people at the time did not say, well, he's never going to make a formal peace with you unless you give him the Golan Heights, because he knew in advance that he wasn't going to get it. But he came. Does it mean that Assad will not demand the Golan Heights? Of course he'll demand it. He demanded it in Madrid. In the last 3 hours of the Madrid conference, Mr. Shamir had gone back to Israel. I was left heading the delegation, and Mr. Ed Derigian, who's now the ambassador to Israel, and then the undersecretary responsible for Near East and Asian affairs, came over to me with a message from James Baker. And the message was this: the Syrians say that unless you declare here and now that you will leave the Golan Heights, then the peace process will be scuttled. The Syrians will not sign a communique that says that they'll go to Washington after Madrid, and the whole peace is gone. And I said, well, you can tell them we're going to Madrid. If they want to come, they can come. And if they don't want to come, they don't have to come. And he came back 5 minutes later and he said, Mr. Baker asked if that's your final answer. And I said, well, no, you can add something else. They demand the Golan Heights. We demand the Golan Heights.
One of the Likud's top leaders was in New York last week.
Eliahu Ben-Elissar was Israel's first ambassador to Egypt, former chairman of the Knesset's Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, and is currently the ranking minority leader on what is probably the most important committee in Israel's parliament.
One of our roving camera people caught up with Mr. Ben-Elissar, and we have some of his reactions to the major issues facing Israel today. Ben-Elissar had this to say about the government's early empowerment plans for the PLO throughout the territories.
And unfortunately, the Israeli government is ready to give so many presents and so many gifts for no quiproquo whatsoever. The early empowerment is actually not needed. But Rabin and Peres are decided to sell out things as quickly as possible, and it's really not needed. We wouldn't have dealt this way, as you can well imagine. We would have dealt tougher, harder, and we are not ashamed of claiming to be tough for the interest of our nation. It's terrible, but unfortunately we can't help it. Moreover so, since Rabin is determined to do whatever he is doing and continue operating with the minimum majority possible, namely 61 out of 120.
When asked about the more right-wing members of the Labour Party and their uneasiness over the PLO deal, and asked whether any Labourites might defect from the government, Ben-Elissar had this to say.
I don't believe that any Labour members will defect. They will vote as one man in favor of the future agreements, precisely as they have voted in favor of Oslo, Washington, and Cairo. Not one single Labour member today will prefer national interests over his own personal political interests.
Ben-Elissar was asked, what are the possibilities of impeding the government's plan to give up the entire Golan to Syria?
Well, at least what we can say that a crushing majority of Israelis are against relinquishing our sovereignty and control over the Golan Heights. By far more, I have to admit it, this is the case, than over Judea and Samaria. Well, we're not talking anymore about Gaza. So this fact, of course, is very important because it can prevent, to some extent at least, or slow down to some extent the rush of the Israeli government. But to tell you that we will be able to stop completely this policy, I'm afraid that it depends much more upon Syria's President Assad than on anybody else. If tomorrow Assad declared himself ready to, for instance, the Egyptian model, full relations with Israel, diplomatic relations, and not very much more, but full peace, Rabin, unfortunately, would be ready to withdraw from the whole of the Golan Heights and go back to the 1949, not 1967, 1949 armistice lines.
Some Israelis are worried over the provision in the Cairo Accords that allows unrestricted access for Palestinian Arabs between Gaza and Jericho going through the northern Negev region of Israel. Mr. Ben-Elissar had the Likud's reaction on this.
This is important, but of minor importance, because there are concessions which have been made by the Israeli government towards the PLO, which are by far of more important significance and influence on the future. As for instance, recognizing in the whole of Judea, Samaria and Gaza one single territorial unity, or as for instance saying in advance that we could not forbid access to Jerusalem for whom? Yasser Arafat, the head of the criminals, which is really almost crazy. So just to tell you that already this controlled but nevertheless free access to Israeli routes, though important, is less important than other facts or other realities.
When asked about the frustrations friends of Likud abroad have been experiencing in that it's tough to stop the tide Israel's government is riding, and if that frustration is being felt in Israel as well, Ben-Elissar offered these recommendations.
1996 is not very far away. This is the election year, and we have a God-given opportunity to change the government, to change the policy, to save the country actually, and the nation. And it's possible. I don't believe that it will be possible until 96. But the campaign is not very far away from us today. We're already in mid-94, and the campaign will start in less than a year. And during the campaign, governments don't take crucial decisions. So correct, 1994 is dangerous, but 95 will already be giving us some hope. In 96, we can change this bad government. And everything has to be focused on this goal, and I think that we should repeat it to all our friends and members and sympathizers and all those Jews and non-Jews of will and to liberty and who love Israel and the state of Israel and Eretz Israel, that it is possible to stop this government from doing the most evil of evil. It's possible.
Joining us tonight is Dr. Heskel Haddad. Dr. Haddad is a vice president of Likud USA. He is the chairman of the World Organization of Jews from Arab Countries, as he was born and raised in Iraq. Dr. Haddad just returned from Israel, where he was representing Likud USA at the recent executive session of the World Zionist Organization. Dr. Haddad, Yasser Arafat announced to great fanfare that he will move to have the PLO charter changed to eliminate those clauses calling for Israel's destruction. Can Arafat be taken at face value on this, and what impact should this have on the peace process?
First, let me say good evening, Caroline. I don't trust Arafat, and I don't believe that he's going to do what he said he will do. First of all, this revocation of the charter of the PLO that calls for the destruction of Israel was supposed to be, according to the Oslo Accords, was supposed to be done already by last Christmas and was not done. So that by that itself, the PLO has abrogated the agreement. And now I don't think that this will be done. I think Arafat would like to make headlines, and that's just a headline.
The Israeli government is talking about early empowerment for the Palestinians and the rest of Judea and Samaria. What does this really mean for Israel? Howard,
I think if you have read the Hebrew papers last week, the head of the Shin Bet, the Shabak, appeared before, in a secret meeting, appeared before the Knesset Committee on Defense, and he stated that this agreement with PLO is dangerous for Israel. They asked him, why didn't you say that before the withdrawal from Gaza and Jericho? He said, because if he would have said it, he would have torpedoed the peace process. Now, I know that Israel will have to be very cautious in what the next step that they would do with the PLO. I think to withdraw from more territory will be a disaster. First, let them see how the Palestinian Arab are going to behave in Jericho and Gaza before they will give them any other territory to govern. They have not been able to govern yet these territories. So I think they still see terrorism emanating from these areas. In Gaza, for example, there are shootouts. These are many terrorist activities are not reported very seriously in the press, but there are terrorist activities more than you hear in the papers. And for this reason, I think Israel should be very, very cautious in the next step.
You were just in Israel over the past few weeks. Is there really widespread opposition to the PLO deal by the man in the street? And what impact, if any, are the street demonstrators having?
I have talked with many people. Many of them were laborites, were actually the one that voted for Rabin. And they are against the peace accords, or at least they are skeptical. Some of them are very fearful. I think the whole mood in Israel is skeptical. Even those who say, well, let's give it a chance, that statement itself is really a skepticism on the part of the people.
The Prime Minister and other members of the cabinet have been harshly critical of the opposition and of the demonstrators. Is the government trying to stifle dissent? And what of their own widespread protests while Begin and Shamir were in office?
I think Rabin's statement against the opposition only demonstrates his panic and his frustration. He knows what he has done is not going to succeed, and he's scared about it. Look what happened in Paris. When he shook hands with Arafat, first he didn't want to shake hands, he hesitated and then shook hands with Arafat. He doesn't trust Arafat, even Rabin. So that I don't think Rabin is a traitor, but I think Rabin is now having second thoughts on this. For this reason, he doesn't want to say it in public. He's saying it in a state of frustration. He's saying that the opposition is causing all these problems, not he. Opposition are enemies of the peace and so on. And this shows that how Rabin himself and the government are panicking.
Some say the PLO deal is exclusively an Israeli affair and that American Jews have no right to get involved in this. What do you say?
I think we have to see that every Jew in the world, especially American Jews, are potential Israeli citizens. For this reason, every Jew has a stake in what happens in Israel. All it takes for a Jew to become an Israeli citizen is to make an immigration, to go and to Israel and say, I'm Oleh Hadash, I'm a new immigrant, and he becomes an Israeli citizen. For this reason, even if he doesn't stay in Israel, even if he leaves Israel, for this reason, every Jew in the world has a stake in Israel, especially in the security of the Jewish state, and also, above all, in the security of Jerusalem.
Finally, Dr. Haddad, a personal question, if you don't mind. Being a Jew from the Arab world, having grown up in Iraq, what is the Arab state of mind on all this, and how can Israel make a secure peace with the Arabs, if at all?
First of all, I would like to say that the majority of the Jews of Arab countries are opposed to this peace process with the PLO. They are not opposed to peace. They are opposed to the peace process with the PLO because they don't trust Arafat, they don't trust PLO. Secondly, I think we know the Arabs very well, and we know to make a deal with an Arab, you have to be very cautious, you have to be mistrustful, and above all, you have to have the upper hand. Otherwise, you will be taken by surprise by the Arab. And that is a mentality. And we know how that mentality. We lived among them. We did trade with them. We lived with them. So that I think if you see in Israel today, the most peaceful border with Israel is with Syria. And the reason why is not because we have the Golan Heights only, but because we can threaten Damascus anytime Syria wants to do anything. When we lose that threat to Damascus, we're going to have Scud missiles on us in Israel. Israel had no threat to Iraq. Iraq sent Scud missiles. If Israel would have threatened Iraq with atomic retaliation, Iraq would not have sent Scud missiles. And this is what we have. In order to make peace, we have to maintain our secure borders, and we have to maintain our strength, and that will be our best security.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haddad, for joining us tonight. Howard?
Thank you, Caroline. July 7th was the 54th anniversary of the passing of Ze'ev Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was the founder 70 years ago of what is today the Likud movement and its Beitar and Tagar youth movements. Menachem Begin was one of Jabotinsky's disciples when, as a young man, he served as head of Beitar in Poland.
Among Jabotinsky's most notable accomplishments was the creation of the Jewish Legion in World War I, the first Jewish army in nearly 2,000 years. The Legion fought in the liberation of Israel from the Ottoman Turks. Jabotinsky was also the founder of both the Haganah and the Irgun, pre-state self-defense organizations.
Jabotinsky's true greatness as a leader was best shown by his incredible foresight, predicting the Holocaust in 1933, urging a worldwide boycott of Nazi Germany at that time, and imploring European Jewry to evacuate Europe in the early 1930s. He was the first to call for Israeli independence from the British back in the 1930s, so Polish Jewry could be saved, and he again called for a Jewish army to fight alongside the Allies in World War II.
Jabotinsky died in New York in 1940. In his will, he specified that his remains were to be transferred to Israel only on the instructions of Jewish government there. And so, in 1964, he was finally laid to rest on Mount Herzl in Jerusalem, not far from the tomb of Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism. Jabotinsky is revered across Israel as one of the nation's spiritual founders. His face appears on the 10-shekel bill, and there's a Jabotinsky street in every major Israeli city. I didn't know there was a Jabotinsky Street in every city.
Yes, there is. In fact, in Ramat Gan, there's an interesting intersection where Jabotinsky Street intersects with David Ben-Gurion Boulevard, which is a soap opera of its own in Israeli politics. But there's also, Caroline, the most important thing, that every city in Israel has in a Barbanel Street.
Really?
Yes.
I'm very impressed, Howard.
There you go. Well, that's all we've got for this evening.
If you'd like a copy of this program or more information, an address and phone number will follow.
On behalf of Caroline and everyone here at JNN, I'm Howard Barbanel, thanking you for letting us share a piece of our world with yours.
Thank you and good night. See you here next time.
הבית שלי, הדרך שלי, הליכוד זה נכון. העתיד שלי, הביטחון שלי, הליכוד זה נכון. בדרך שלנו נביא השלום, בנייה עלייה, הגשמת החלום. כולנו היחד, כל אחד לחוד, יודעים שזה נכון.